Good evening and welcome to what's going to be a wonderful program this evening, our Lewis Guy History Series program for October. I'm Peggy McPhillips. I am the president of Norfolk Historical Society. A couple of housekeeping things for you. This program is being recorded, so after you watch it tonight and love it, as I know you will, you can go back onto our website. You can watch it again. You can share the link with anyone who was so unfortunate as to miss it. So we are recording it. During the program, as our presenter goes on and talks about his book, you will notice down at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat feature, also a Q&A feature. If you have questions or comments throughout the program, go ahead and type them in and I will keep track of them and throw them all at Andrew at the end of the program for him to address. Want to introduce our speaker tonight. I am so happy to have Andrew Lawler. He is a journalist and a Norfolk native, and he is so far the author of 3 books. You may remember him from earlier this year when he brought us his book, The Lost Token, which was about the mystery in the 16th century of the group that became known as the Lost Colonists down in North Carolina, and some new clues that have come along that help us think of a possibility where they might have ended up. Well, he's on another mystery tonight in his newest book. The book is so new, it hasn't even been released yet. The release date is November 2nd, and it is another sort of a history mystery that goes back even farther. It is called Under Jerusalem, and it talks about all of the things that happened during archaeological excavations of the city of Jerusalem. The book, as I said, will be released on November 2nd. You can order it ahead of time. You can pre-order it at Prince Books in Norfolk. You can shop local. An added incentive to order it from Prince, Andrew will be in town that week. And if you order it from Prince and put a note in the notes section to them that you would like to have it personalized and even tell them how you would like the inscription to read, he will autograph it for you personally, just because you were here in the program tonight. And you can pick it up at Prince that week. So that's a little something to keep in mind. I've ordered mine. I'm excited. I wish I could have it in my hands right now. This is a very special presentation. It is Andrew's first presentation, his first talk about this book. You could look at yourselves as guinea pigs, or you can look at yourselves as being a really special audience for this premiere event. He will be speaking to other groups. He's got a whole armload of other programs that he's doing, but tonight is the first. And later on, when he becomes really, really famous and is hard to get, you can say you saw him here first. So sit back now and enjoy a trip back in time, 1,000 years back in time or so, to a part of the world that's rich in history. It is sacred to 3 world religions. And as the title or the subtitle relays to us, it is the world's most contested city. So here now, please welcome Andrew Lawler and his talk about his new book, Under Jerusalem. Andrew, it's all yours.
Thank you, Peggy. And it's a delight to be here. The Norfolk Historical Society is close to my heart, being a Norfolk native, and Peggy having been the Norfolk historian for so long. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to come and hear what I found after my little journey in the Holy Land. So let's start. I'm going to share my screen and give you a little bit of a taste of what I found when I was in Jerusalem. So first, just to give you a little background, I hope you can all see the title slide. And these images, by the way, were taken by the National Geographic photographer I work with when I was in Jerusalem for off and on for about 3 years doing a story for Geographic that got bigger and bigger and turned into a book. Now, I've been a journalist covering the Middle East and cultural heritage and archaeology for about 20 years. And to tell you the truth, I avoided Jerusalem like the plague. Why? Well, because there was so much in the way of religion and politics that went along with any archaeology there that I thought I should just steer clear. And now that I'm older and far less wise, I decided that it's actually that strange combination of politics, religion, and science which makes this place so unique. And this all started out a few years ago. I was in Israel for a conference, and I was in Jerusalem and met with this archaeologist who offered to take me on a tour. I'd been to the city before. I thought I'd seen most of what there was to see, but lo and behold, I had no idea. He took me underground to a series of excavations, tunnels, caves, what have you, that showed me that what I was seeing above, what most tourists see, is really only a fraction of this city. And that got me hooked. And the more I literally dug, I tried to avoid the digging, I just watched the diggers. The more I really explored this, the more I realized that there was a very important story that has never really been told in this way. So hold on, and we're going to go on a very quick tour of Jerusalem, its history, and what the archaeology tells us today about the Holy City. So first of all, let's get ourselves oriented. If we were in person, I'd say raise your hand if you've been to Jerusalem, and I bet a lot of hands would go up. But for those of you who haven't, I thought it'd be nice to orient us. And of course, Jerusalem is in the Middle East. In what is some call Israel, some say it's Palestine, depending on your politics when it comes to the city that is still divided in so many ways. But if you look at it from space, it's not divided at all. It is in fact visible from satellite. And as we zoom in, you'll see that Jerusalem is located just on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, just inland, in the mountainous area that's between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea, which you see coming up on your right. And you see it's in a very hilly area. See how rugged it is. And now we're looking at the Temple Mount, as it's known to the Jews, the noble sanctuary, as Muslims call it. This is the place that is considered sacred to both of those religions. Not far away, to the left there, is the Holy Sepulchre, which is the most sacred site for Christians. So in this very small area, it's no bigger. The old city itself, surrounded by walls, it's a fraction of the size of Central Park. You have these incredible shrines, this density of shrines to these three religions, which helps explain why this is such a contested city. Okay, now I wanted to mention this. This is a little bit outside of what I've been reporting on, but it's important to mention that even before there was a Jerusalem, we now know that there was a very large urban area just a few miles away from the old city. This has just been unearthed in the past few years. It's a very exciting find that tells us that there were thousands of people living in this area. We didn't know this, and these are some of the objects that were found. You can see there to the top right and the bottom left that show that that Jerusalem, even before it was Jerusalem, was a place that people wanted to come and live. Now, moving to the history of the city that we know, what I discovered, it really is a city based on water and stone. What do I mean by that? Well, what's under Jerusalem is limestone. And this is very conducive to water moving through underground. It creates caves and brings springs out to the ground above. So even in what looks like a very dry area, you get a very, very reliable water source. You'll see at the bottom right here, let me see if I can get my cursor on it, right there, you'll see a spring which comes out from this hill, the eastern hill. And now this is that area that is today known as the Temple Mount or Noble Sanctuary. Those are the walls built around the time of Herod. And then here is the walls of the old city that go around that area. So you see it's a very rugged country. So we're going to do a flash tour of Jerusalem history. Now, this is a city that has what is perhaps the most complicated history of any place on earth. So I'm just going to fly through it, and then we're going to get to the main event, which is talking about what the archaeologists have found and what they haven't found. So Jerusalem as a city first begins to form around 3000 BC, right at the time that you have the first cities growing in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. And at that time, these people built their homes near that spring that I mentioned. And then over time, there were more and more settlers that were moving there. We have some of the first mentions of Jerusalem coming around 2000 BC. And then the first fortifications that archaeologists have found show up around 1800. And that image you see there, that's one of the first piece of writing that's been found in Jerusalem, that one in the center there, in cuneiform, which was the lingua franca, or the way you would write in Mesopotamia in that era. So you had a lot of contacts with both Egypt. If you look to the left there, you'll see a figure that clearly is Egyptian. So you have a kind of a crossroads between the Egyptian Empire and the Mesopotamian empires. And Jerusalem is in this rugged area in between. So a lot of influence back and forth. For a time, Jerusalem was part of the Egyptian Empire, and then later, when there was a collapse of Egyptian civilization, there were independent Canaanite kingdoms. Now, the Canaanites were people who lived in that area, who had a particular kind of language and culture, but they weren't an empire. They simply had kingdoms spread across what we call the Levant. And I'll make a note to the right there. That's an image of the fortifications built around the spring that I mentioned. And you see the city walls beyond. So now we have archaeological evidence that while the city was not a very big one in terms of Mesopotamia or Egypt, it was substantial in the fortifications built so that the water source was protected. Okay, now we're going to do one slide to tell you everything that happened between the time that the Judeans arrived in Jerusalem sometime after 1000 or so BC, up until the time the Romans destroyed Jerusalem around 70 CE, in other words, 30 or so years after the death of Jesus. So the city began, as I mentioned, as it was a fair-sized town that was surrounded by walls. And the Judeans arrived, and we'll talk about that later. This is one of the real controversial issues in Jerusalem archaeology, as to what exactly went on then in that first couple of centuries when I call them Judeans, you can call them Israelites. Generally, archaeologists don't use the term Jews until later, until the 1st or 2nd century BCE, when you have a really defined religion. But at this point, it's a culture. So around 700 or so BC, the Assyrians take over this area, and Jerusalem is subsumed into this Mesopotamian empire. Then later, of course, you've heard of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, and the Judean elite are exiled. And later, the Persian Empire takes over the Babylonians, and the Judean elite go back to Jerusalem. But the city is very slow to recover. And this is the era that many scholars think large portions of the what Christians call the Old Testament was written. Now, after a couple hundred years of fair prosperity, Alexander the Great arrives, conquers the Middle East, and there go the Persians. Persians are gone. Alexander quickly dies, though, and the empire is split up into competing entities. And Jerusalem is lying right kind of on the border between the Egyptians and those who control the Mesopotamian area and Turkey to the north. And so this is a very difficult time for Jerusalem, because you have these Hellenistic rulers that are always fighting over Jerusalem and other places in that area. Finally, around 141 BC, the Judeans throw off the yoke of the Hellenistic rulers and they gain independence, but it doesn't last long because Rome is on the march. And pretty soon, the Romans are controlling that region, incorporated into the empire, but they also are smart enough to put a Judean or Jewish ruler in charge, and this is Herod the Great, a name you're all familiar with. And he begins this great building program. But again, this period of florescence doesn't last long. The image on the bottom right is an artist's conception of the destruction of Jerusalem, including the Jewish temple that Herod had renovated in the era of Jesus. So at the end of that, we can kind of say that era of Jerusalem is over. So you've got that first couple of millennium, then you've got the biblical millennium, and then you've got the last two. Real quickly, what happens is after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Romans come back and they decide to rebuild it in the image of a really well-planned Roman city. And that's the city that, for the most part, you as a tourist visiting Jerusalem will see today. Now, one of the big events in the 4th century is the Holy Sepulchre, the site that is the place where Jesus is believed to have been crucified and buried. And this is a hot topic we'll get back to shortly, was consecrated. The structure built around it was consecrated. And for several centuries, Jerusalem really blossoms, becomes a very populated and wealthy town, lots of pilgrims. And then the Muslims arrive. But nevertheless, Jerusalem remains mostly a Christian city for several centuries, and then gradually becomes more of a Muslim town until the Crusaders arrive. We all know that story. Crusaders who come from Europe, who decide it's time to take back the Holy Sepulchre from the hands of people they view as heretics. And for a brief period, Jerusalem is again under Christian control, but Western Christian control. And then after Saladin, the great Kurdish general who becomes the head of a new empire in that region, he managed to reconquer Jerusalem. And that's the end of the Crusaders. And this area becomes Jerusalem becomes a center of several Arab kingdoms and becomes an important city in the Arab world until 1516, when the Ottomans, this is about the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Ottomans move in from Turkey and they take over. They've got some cannons, they've got high technology in their weapons, and they're able to oust the Arabs. So for the next 500 years, almost exactly 500 years, the Ottoman Turks, Ottoman Turkish-speaking people, they control Jerusalem until the British kicked them out at the end of World War I. They went with the wrong side. They went with the Germans rather than with the British and the other allies. And the British hold on to what turns out to be a very hot potato for 40 years or so. And then finally, Israel is created. Jerusalem is divided during a war. It's divided between East and West. And that remains the status quo until 1967, when East Jerusalem becomes part of Israel, part of the Israeli capital. And we'll get to that in a bit, because that had profound implications for the archaeology of Jerusalem. Okay, now this is the part that I realized had never really been delved into. Some historians have written about this, but I became fascinated with how Jerusalem was rediscovered, the rediscovery of biblical Jerusalem. And here's a quote from a famous archaeologist named Charles Warren. He said, "As Jerusalem is a system of arches, every house being built of vaulted rooms, it may be said that the holy city never sleeps." So what's unusual about Jerusalem is that over time, you build a house made with arches. There's not much wood around, so you have to build, but there's plenty of stone. So you build arches to hold up your first floor, and you have a cellar below. And then over time, the city begins to rise. So you cover up that first floor, that becomes your cellar. And over time, buildings begin to rise. So you have all these levels, many of which remain remarkably intact, filled with debris, filled with sewage and what have you. But nevertheless, they're still there, lying underneath, sleeping, because these arches continue to hold up the city. So this is something that the archaeologists had not understood and didn't recognize until the 1800s, when the field of archaeology begins to come to the fore. Now, the first era of Western archaeology, these are Christian explorers that come from the West. The first guy is a Frenchman named de Saulcy. He's a French senator, actually, friend of the emperor, Napoleon's nephew. And he finds this amazing sarcophagus filled with bones in the Tomb of the Kings, which lies just outside of Jerusalem's old city. Now, in digging up this old, presumably Jewish grave, he infuriated the Jewish community. The Jewish community said, "You are robbing our graves." So from the outset, there was politics and religion involved with these digs, because de Saulcy was a very well-connected Frenchman, and the the Ottomans, who controlled Jerusalem, did not want to offend France. So they let him dig, but in turn, that pissed off the local people. So from the start, digging in Jerusalem has been a very problematic enterprise, because you've got people living there who have seen this for centuries as a holy place. And Westerners coming in to dig things up, they were not very welcome. So the British got news of this French find, which became a sensation across Europe. And at that time, think of it like the space race, kind of like the Soviets and the Americans back in the 1960s were trying to get to the moon first. Suddenly, Jerusalem became kind of a moonshot, where you had the British and the French competing. And as with what happened in the 1960s, the French, like the Russians, pulled ahead in the beginning, but then were surpassed by the United States in the case of Russia, and then by Britain in the case of France. So this was an international competition to get remains from that could be tied to the Bible. This was considered a holy grail, if you'll forgive me the pun, for archaeology at the time. And the British were very smart by setting up a Palestine Exploration Fund. And they got support not just from the British government, but mainly from British Christians and some British Jews who donated to this so that they could send people like Charles Wilson on the far left, seen in his cap he was wearing when he was drawing the boundary between the United States and Canada before he went to Jerusalem. But the really key person in this race is Charles Warren. He's the guy sitting on the camp stool there to the left in that photograph in the center with this kind of rough looking bunch, except for the Reverend in the center, doesn't look quite so rough. Now, Charles Warren was an interesting figure, a British Army officer who explored in a way that no one since has explored beneath Jerusalem. Why? Well, partly because he was one of the first, and he had a very difficult relationship with the Turkish governor, who was in charge of, the Ottoman governor was in charge of kind of keeping things in Jerusalem quiet, keeping people happy, not letting the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims fight amongst themselves. And Charles Warren shows up saying, hey, I want to dig. And the Ottoman governor wasn't pleased with this, but Warren would not be stopped. And so he cajoled, he pleaded, he did things illegally, he did whatever he could to get as much information he could about what was below Jerusalem. And this image is a famous painting that was done of Warren's investigation of the great, what's called the Great Sea. It's just an example of one underground space in Jerusalem. This is underneath the Temple Mount, or Noble Sanctuary. And it is large enough to hold enough water to fill 2 Goodyear blimps. We're talking about a massive, massive space that had been carved out over time, partially natural, partially cut by humans. And Warren was one of the first to be able to actually map all of the underground spaces beneath the Temple Mount, beneath the city's Acropolis. And this is something that hasn't been repeated because this has been a very sacred place, the third most sacred place in Islam. Other people have not been welcome to probe beneath the surface. So Warren left an important legacy. He befriended many of the Jews in Jerusalem, and he felt very empathetic to them. And later, not long after, he actually suggested that the Jews return, come back from Europe and the United States in order to create a Jewish state. But Muslims, on the other hand, weren't very thrilled with this guy because not only was he digging often near or underneath their holy site, but he also was causing houses to crack, foundations to crack, and people were worried that he was literally undermining this important Muslim area. So this is a legacy that has important implications for what comes next. And here's some wonderful images and paintings made of Warren underground and Corporal Bertels to the right there, who was his sidekick. They took enormous risks in going underground to an area that had not been explored, that was extremely dangerous. But you'll see he was quite famous. He was called he was called Jerusalem, Warren of Jerusalem, or Jerusalem's Warren. There in the center, you can see the image that appeared in a British periodical. So he was able to, for the first time, really map the area underneath Jerusalem that was associated with biblical times. But in the 1880s, there was a new question that came up that had been bugging Christians for a long time, and that is the Holy Sepulchre, the place that is considered to be the home of the tomb and the site, the tomb of Jesus and the site of his crucifixion, is this real? Is it authentic? This was a hot topic back in the 1880s because tourists were coming from Europe and America and saying, well, I want to see the real place where Jesus was crucified, the real place where he was buried. And there was a long, long tradition going back to the 4th century that this was the spot. But there was a problem with that. That if in fact this is where Jesus was crucified and where he was buried, and according to Christian belief, where he rose from the dead, then why is it that the Holy Sepulchre is located in the middle of Jerusalem, not outside of its walls? Because the gospel accounts say that Golgotha, the place where he was crucified, was outside the city walls. So Protestants said, well, this proves that those Catholics and Orthodox people who run the show in the Holy Sepulchre, because remember, the Protestants, they don't have any place there. They arrive too late to the party. They don't have a part of the Holy Sepulchre they can call their own. So Protestants were very skeptical, both because it wasn't theirs and they couldn't get a piece of it, and also because of the biblical account seeming to contradict what was there on the ground. So you'll see on your left that image. I'll bring my cursor if you can see that. There's the Holy Sepulchre. And question is, well, where's the wall today is here, but back then the wall went something like that. So if it did that, then in fact it would be outside the walls. So the question is, where is the wall? Where was the wall from that period of the time of Jesus? And this man at the bottom, Conrad Schick, is the one who had an idea. He said, let's use archaeology to decide this issue. And he got funding from the Russians, who were also very interested in archaeology and in showing one way or the other whether or not the Holy Sepulchre was in fact the authentic place of Jesus's of his crucifixion and his burial. So I'll get back to what they found in a second, because meanwhile, this guy named Charles Gordon, you may have heard of Gordon of Khartoum, famous British general, later killed in the Sudan during military action. Well, he was also a bit of an oddball. He had this very interesting version of Christianity. While he was a Protestant, he also believed in lots of doctrines that were influenced by his time in the East. And when he arrived in Jerusalem on sabbatical, he decided that the Holy Sepulchre obviously is not the right place. It's obviously a fraud. And within days, he said he had found the real place. Now, Golgotha is an Aramaic word, which means the place of the skull. So based on this, he looked out his window, looked at a hill, bottom right, you can see this hill, and he saw what he thought was a skull. The bottom right, you'll see on the left is an image taken of a quarry just outside of the old city. If you're looking out a window in the old city, you can see that. And on the right is someone who's kind of filled in the blanks to show, you see, this is the place of the skull. This is obviously the place where Jesus was buried. It is outside the walls and it looks like a skull. Okay, it's a no-brainer. But Gordon went even farther. He actually came up with this even wilder idea that the skull hill, that the skull there on the right, the skull hill on the right, if you look at the on the left-hand side, that sketch, that here's the place of the crucifixion. And he imagined that actually Jerusalem was lined up like a body, that where the, let's say the illumination part is at the Dome of the Rock, or where the Jewish temple was. And as one French scholar said, it was a wonderfully weird idea that managed to insult everybody, not just Muslims, but Jews as well. But this idea gained a lot of currency, that this place, this skull place, was the site of the true crucifixion. And today you can go visit the Garden Tomb. It's in fact a very popular place for Protestants to go visit. even though there's absolutely no archaeological evidence to link it at all with the first century, much with the tomb of Jesus. But nevertheless, this gives you an idea of the intensity. People really wanted to know. And often science was used to confirm beliefs that people already had when they arrived. And I'll get back to our friend Conrad Schick there, because in the end, he did show that the wall of the first century likely was located just to the east of the Holy Sepulchre. That is, that the Holy Sepulchre was located in what had been outside the walls of Jerusalem in the first century. And so that was pretty good evidence that this tradition has some validity. Now, by the 1890s, the big question was, now that we kind of know the Holy Sepulchre appears to be the right place, although Protestants will still go to the Garden Tomb for the next century or two, the big question was, where's the city of David? Now, if you remember, I mentioned that the Judeans arrived, the Israelites arrived in Jerusalem sometime after 1000 BC. Question is, well, where's the city that David took over, that he conquered, and the city that was made beautiful and glorious by Solomon? We all know how Solomon is famous for being the wealthy king of an empire, and the Queen of Sheba came to visit him. And well, if that's the case, they would have left behind quite a bit of archaeological remains of a major city. But the problem was nobody could find it. Nobody could find even a pot that's clearly dated from this period. Now, if you look on this map to the right, you'll see here's the sacred platform, the Temple Mount or Noble Sanctuary, and here's that little eastern hill that we saw at the beginning. And this is an area that was a candidate, and also over here, what's called Mount Zion, which is outside of today's walls, but which had been within the walls. This seemed like a good candidate too, to dig to find remains from this most famous of biblical eras. So these guys on the left who look like fraternal twins, it's Frederick Bliss and Archibald Dickey. I admit I can't tell you who was who, but they began a dig under the Palestine Exploration Fund to determine where the city of David was, where this original Judean Jerusalem, and actually the original Jerusalem itself, because the presumption was it was where the Canaanite city had been. So they roughed it for quite a while, digging on Mount Zion, and then moved to this eastern hill. And they were able to find some pretty good evidence that, in fact, this eastern hill was the place. That's the place of the original Jerusalem. And then came what has to be the most fantastic of Jerusalem archaeological adventures. And you just can't make this stuff up. A British aristocrat found this Finnish psychic slash poet slash geographer who believed that he had cracked the code of a certain place in the Bible that revealed the location of Solomon's treasures, including the Ark of the Covenant, the famous ark that was said in the Bible to have contained the 10 Commandments, that had vanished. No one knew where it had gone to. And he was convinced, this British aristocrat, Captain Montague Parker, was convinced he knew exactly where this was. And so they launched a dig for a couple of years. They dug in Jerusalem. And this is such a fun chapter. I wish I could go into detail, but in the end, they ended up digging illegally by bribing a guard, digging under the Dome of the Rock, this sacred place in the middle of the Noble Sanctuary, the Temple Mount. And in doing so, sparked riots, international crisis, and also set in motion a whole series of events that have really changed the nature of Jerusalem. But that's all I can say for the moment. And meantime, this idea of finding the ark really caught fire. And suddenly, Jews in Europe were saying, wait a second, these Christians are digging up our heritage. We shouldn't let them do that. We should get involved. So pretty soon, Baron Edmond de Rothschild, who was a French baron, he decided to get a jump on these British aristocrats. And he hired a French archaeologist who also happened to be Jewish, named Raymond Weil, and they went searching for the ark and for David's tomb. And in the end, they found a tomb. Whether or not it's David's or not remains a bit of a debate. But it just shows you that, again, this competition among the powers and now among Christians and Jews to find the biblical past really intensified. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this. The 20th century, Jerusalem was a mess. Went back and forth between different groups. You can see there some of the highlights, but the point is that by the end, in 1948, when Israel was created, Jerusalem was divided between Israel and Jordan, with the old city, the part that contained all the important shrines, located in the Jordanian sector. But that all changed in 1967. You've all heard of the 6 Days War. And in that year, Israel managed to gain control of that whole area, as well as, of course, the West Bank and Gaza, and which now are known as occupied territories. And they, most importantly, got control of the old city. So for the first time, you had Israeli Jews in charge of the old city. And this had profound implications. In the 1970s, for the first time, there was a chance to dig in the old city, partly because a large plaza was cleared to make the West Mall Plaza, demolishing a largely medieval, what's called the Mughrabi quarter, an Arab quarter, was demolished by Israel to create that plaza we see there today. And also the Jewish quarter, which had been damaged during the war, during the Jordanian occupation, was also being reconstructed. So vast areas of the old city for the first time are accessible to archaeologists. Because remember, people are living there. You can't just go underground like Warren and dig all the time. So you have these two men. On the left, you have Benjamin Mazar, and on the right, you have a very interesting character named Meir Ben Dov, who both dug and were digging together, actually, and they found two very different things. On the one hand, they found strong evidence for the city planned by Herod the Great and finished by his successors in the 1st century that was destroyed by Rome, that showed this really was a magnificent city. But more interestingly, Ben Dov uncovered remains of these massive palaces that were built shortly after the Muslims arrived in Jerusalem. And you can see there at the top right, these palaces that are alongside the noble sanctuary. Here's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Here's the Dome of the Rock. So suddenly there's this new view of a Jerusalem where the Muslims really invested a lot beyond just the religious structures. And this was something that was not known in the text. So it's only through archaeology, and ironically, by Israeli Jewish archaeologists, that we know of the incredible investment that the early Muslims put into Jerusalem. Now, again, I don't have time to go into this. I'll just say that there was this fantastically complicated and controversial tunnel dug by rabbis that went along the whole Western Wall. So we know that Western Wall, that piece of the Western Wall that shows that where people pray, but there's also a tunnel along the foundations. And it's been the source of a lot of knowledge, archaeological knowledge, as well as a great deal of bloodshed. But for now, that's all I'll say on that. Fascinating chapter about a rabbi who tried to find the Ark beneath the Temple Mount itself, which ended in yet another international crisis. But by the 1980s, the interest kind of turned back to the area outside of the old city. Where was the early Judean capital? Where was David and Solomon? And this was a matter of political importance, because since Israel had conquered and maintained that East Jerusalem was part of Israel, it was important to show that, in fact, this had been an important Jewish area or Judean area back in 1000 BC, but there was no archaeological evidence. So in 1993, there was a breakthrough when a stone was found outside, actually in northern Israel, that mentioned the house of David. It was the first time that David had been mentioned outside of the Bible. So suddenly there's this idea that, well, maybe it's not just a myth, as some contended, although I have to note there's still no mention outside of the Bible, a contemporary mention of Solomon. But that inspired people to start digging again in Jerusalem to see if they could find it. Now, there were new digs that did find some important new structures, but it turned out most of them appeared to be earlier. earlier Canaanite. And then there was this whole debate about, well, can you really tell what is 10th century BC and what's 8th century BC? And I won't get into that, but that's a very important debate in order to determine who came when to Jerusalem, which, as I mentioned, has important political implications. And here's a palace that, here's a structure that an archaeologist named Elat Mazar, who just passed away in May, claimed to have found, or that she found, that she claimed was likely the Palace of David. I won't go into the archaeological debate about this, but let's just say that this remains a very, very controversial find. And meanwhile, very close by, there was an effort in the 2010s to dig this enormous tunnel that went all the way from the base of that eastern hill all the way up to the Temple Mount, to the Noble Sanctuary. And there's an image on the left of the tunnel as it's nearing completion. That's Joe Uziel on the left, who showed me and spent a good deal of time with me showing what they'd found. And on the top right is Nashon Zanton. He is the one who examined the coins down below and determined that this was built, this enormous stepped path, which you can see as an artist's conception of it there on the bottom right, was built as an important thoroughfare moving up from the bottom of the Eastern Hill to the Temple Mount, but it was not Herod who built it. In fact, it probably was Pontius Pilate, which casts a whole new light on Jerusalem as not a place that the Romans despised, but as a place that the Romans actually built up and invested in. Now, meanwhile, and I'll only mention the minute or two, just we should note that in the midst of all these digs going on, there's enormous controversy happening above ground, partly because this tunnel is causing damage, according to those who live above. On the far left, you'll see a gentleman I visited, Arafat Hamdan, who showed me how his house was, he believed, was being wrecked by the tunnel below. And also you have this fight over who owns what the Jews call the city of David and what the Palestinians call Wadi Hilwa. And the man on the top right, David Barry, is the one who runs the organization that has funded most of these archaeological digs. He's controversial for encouraging, for trying to buy and succeeding in buying Arab houses and installing Jewish settlers. So you have to keep in mind that as the archaeology is happening, the politics is going on at the same moment. And here's one last big dig I wanted to mention that's nearby. You'll see on the far right, you can see it's just below the Noble Sanctuary, Temple Mount. Enormous dig, the Govati parking lot, that has found incredible things from all periods. And there'll actually be an article coming out on this in Archaeology magazine in January. So keep your eyes out for that. More details to come. So to wrap up, again, I'm not going to go through all these points, but what archaeology has shown is that a lot of our ideas about Jerusalem are questionable. We don't really think anymore, archaeologists as a whole don't really think that the Bible accurately reflects what Jerusalem looked like during the time of David and Solomon. Probably a much smaller town. What was written about it was written later, looking back on a perceived golden age. So this is an important reminder that what the texts say isn't necessarily true, and archaeology can give us a little bit better idea of the facts on the ground, as it were. And the other piece I want to leave you with is that the way that Zionism and the state of Israel came into being were heavily influenced by Western Christians. We don't really think about it that way, but I came to the conclusion that really it was Western Christians who were largely responsible for setting in motion the events that have created the Israel of today and made Jerusalem such a contested city. And I'd like to suggest, though, that the archaeology that they did also holds a key for us to move beyond our very narrow narratives about who owns this and who owns that, to look in a wider way at the incredible diversity of cultures that have come together in Jerusalem, the religious innovations that have happened that are the result of a combination of people's meeting and clashing and exchanging ideas. Finally, I just want to say more to come. I was telling Peggy the story that on the left, you'll see Saleh Herbawe, who runs a grocery store there in the old city where I was staying. And one day he said, well, who are you? You're not a tourist. You keep coming back here. And I said, well, I'm doing a story and writing about under Jerusalem. And he went over and he pulled up this hatch and went down, and you can see the ladder at there on the in the middle, the top there. There's the ladder going down from this space, and inside was this enormous Crusader hall that became the source of enormous controversy between the Coptic monks who lived next door in the Holy Sepulchre, who claimed it, and this Arab businessman who said, no, this is mine. That's a whole very fun chapter in my book that tells a lot about what's still left to find. Bottom there is just an example of a cafe where, yeah, there's another hatch down below. That's the photographer at the bottom right, Simon Norfolk, and our producer, trying to do a little exploration in a cistern, beneath the cistern, in this cafe. So still so much to find in Jerusalem. We've only scratched the surface. So that's it for now. This is very quick, but I wanted to leave everyone a chance to ask questions. And I just want to thank National Geographic for supporting this. The Society provided me with some extra funding to go back and forth over the past 3 years. And I can't say enough about the patience of the archaeologists who allowed me to bug them when they should have been doing their work, and the residents of Jerusalem who always were interested and willing to talk to me about what was going on and their views of their city's incredible past. So thanks very much. And Peggy, I'll turn it over to you, and happy to answer questions.
That was so interesting. And I wrote down that there's more to come. It seems like they're discovering things all the time. I heard something on public radio within the last week about the discovery of what they think was a winery that was apparently made good quality wine for the elite. So all the time. So I guess we'll be updated.
Yes.
We have one question about your immersion in Jerusalem. You said you spent quite some time there. What was the city like when you were there? Is it vibrant, noisy? What was it like to actually live there for the amount of time you did?
Yes, I spent most of my time in the old city itself, and it's a very contained, medieval-like feeling place, surrounded by walls, small alleys. There's always places that you come across that you didn't know were there. You always get lost, or I always got lost. And it's truly astonishing how such a small area can contain so many religious places and cultural heritage spots. It was dazzling to me. And at the same time, it's a very ordinary place where people live and shop. You know, the souk there is not primarily for tourists. It really is for the locals. But I have to say that it's a place that's very tense, and you feel it. And after about 3 weeks, it was time for me to come home, because you are in a walled city, and which the walls were built to protect, but they also enclose. And after a while, I did feel a little claustrophobic, and was happy to get back on that plane and come back to the mountains of North Carolina.
I can imagine. Well, if you send us information about the article in Archaeology magazine, we can put that on the website.
Yes, I'd be happy to. I'll do that. Comes out in January, and there are a couple of other articles that will be appearing as well. And you can also check out my Facebook. That's a good way to follow where I'm going to be.
Good idea. Okay.
Yeah, I will be going a pretty extensive tour, partly online, but some in-person events. And also on my website, andrewlawler.com, there's also a list of the tour places, as well as recent stories that I'm doing about this topic, that some of details and things that didn't get into the book that I'll have coming out as magazine stories in the coming weeks.
I can see you writing about this for a long, long time.
Oh, yes.
And I will mention, Andrew is also working on another book that I won't give it away yet, but it has some local connections, local to Norfolk. So more about that.
Don't give away too much, Peggy.
As it comes along. And don't forget, if you pre-order your book from Prince Books, Andrew will personalize it the week of November 1st. It comes out on November 2nd election day, and he will be in town that week, so he can actually personalize it.
Yep.
I have oh, wait a minute, there's a chat question. Oh, is the archaeological work still going on in Jerusalem? Is there anything major that they're working on now?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's always digs going on. And this is a city that has been more excavated than any other place on earth. And those excavations continue to this day. So at any given time, there are, a dozen or more excavations going on, most of them very small. But the largest, which is the one you can really visit as a tourist, which is most worthwhile, is the Govati parking lot. That's the one I mentioned toward the end.
Oh, right.
That shows you every level of Jerusalem's history. And it goes all the way back to about the time of the Babylonian destruction, all the way to early Islamic times. And it really gives you a feel for what's happening in not just in the biblical era, but also in other times in Jerusalem. And we can't forget that the city really existed longer outside of that biblical time than it did within the biblical time. So the history is far richer than most of us suspect.
So they're still finding artifacts and cultural clues, and
that's
absolutely fascinating.
Yes. In fact,
okay.
Any other questions?
I don't see any, but thank you so much. And y'all, I will remind you, this is being recorded, so it should go up on our website within the next day or two at the most, and you can actually go and watch it again. I will tell you that next month's program, November 10th, our speaker will be Edwin Bascana. I hope I'm not butchering his name. Ted is the Director of Historic Trades and Skills with the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. So he will be speaking to us again by Zoom on November 10th, and we will send out an announcement about that soon. We're still hoping to get back in the MacArthur Memorial Visitor Center Theater. This will be back together again one day, people. We're all looking forward to it. But in the meantime, I'm so glad you joined us by Zoom. It's a way to keep our programs going and kind of keep in touch. So come back November 10th. Andrew, thank you again. And good night, everybody.
Thank you, Peggy.
Thanks.